At the end of April, Taiwan's President Lai was forced to cancel a diplomatic trip to Eswatini after multiple countries abruptly denied overflight access to his aircraft, an extraordinary move in international diplomacy. About the same time, the government of Zambia pulled the plug on RightsCon 2026, the world's leading summit on human rights and technology, reportedly because Taiwanese civil society participants were planning to attend in person. Two separate incidents, one common thread: pressure from the Chinese Communist Party. In this episode, we investigate how Beijing extends its influence far beyond its borders, leaning on governments, shaping global events, and working systematically to isolate Taiwan and erase its presence on the world stage. Hello and welcome to Perspectives with Nilo, where we go beyond the headlines to examine how history, foreign influence and competing narratives shape modern democracies. I'm your host, Neil O'Sullivan. If this is your first time joining us on the podcast, we have over 80 past episodes. Recently, we covered such topics as China's interference in Ireland, the history of Taiwan, as well as the plight of the Uyghur people, and much more. You can find all of our past episodes by searching for Perspectives with Nilo on your favourite podcast app or on our blog site at pwnilo.com. That's pwneilo.com. And while you're there, we'd really appreciate your support. With so many podcasts available nowadays, it can be tough for smaller shows to break through. Hitting that subscribe or follow button on your podcast app goes a long way in helping us grow. And thanks in advance for your support. In our previous podcast episode entitled "The Chinese Ambassador Was Wrong," we spoke with Deputy Barry Ward of Fine Gael about his response to the Chinese ambassador's letter to the Irish Times that warned Irish parliamentarians against visiting Taiwan and engaging with the country's democratically elected leaders. This is not the first time a Chinese Communist Party official has interfered in Irish affairs and made such veiled threats. And while this behaviour exposes the hypocrisy and arrogance of China's authoritarian regime, it also causes us to wonder what else the Chinese Communist Party are capable of outside their own jurisdiction. Unfortunately, given the recent surge of events, we don't have far to look to find examples. On April 22nd last, Taiwan's President William Lai planned to travel to the small southern African nation of Eswatini. The country formerly known as Swaziland is one of Taiwan's 12 diplomatic allies, and President Lai had been invited to attend celebrations on April 25th, marking King Mswati III's 58th birthday and 40th anniversary of his reign. However, on the eve of the president's departure, Taiwan's presidential office suspended the trip after a number of countries on the flight path abruptly and unexpectedly revoked overflight permissions. At an impromptu press conference, the presidential office in Taipei said 3 countries, Seychelles, Mauritius and Madagascar, along the planned flight route to Eswatini had rescinded overflight permission unexpectedly and without justification. Presidential Office Secretary General Pan Meng-an said the Seychelles, Mauritius and Madagascar unilaterally revoked flight permits for the presidential aircraft to cross their countries without prior warning. He told a news conference in Taipei that the actual reason was intense pressure exerted by Chinese authorities, including economic coercion. According to Reuters news agency, Seychelles and Madagascar said they took the decision because they do not recognize Taiwan. Seychelles' Foreign Affairs Ministry said that the Taiwanese president's plane had not been granted clearance for overflight or landing, in line with the government's long-standing policy of not recognizing Taiwan's sovereignty. A Madagascar Foreign Ministry official also confirmed having denied an overflight request. Malagasy diplomacy recognises only one China. The decision was made in full respect of Madagascar's sovereignty over its airspace, the official said. Taiwanese presidents normally have no problems overflying countries with which the island does not have formal relations, but China harbours a particular dislike of President Lai, whom it calls a separatist. A senior Taiwan security official told Reuters news agency that the government's understanding was that China applied pressure on the Seychelles, Madagascar and Mauritius, threatening economic sanctions, including revoking debt relief. In a statement on X, President Lai criticised China's coercive actions, saying that it exposed the risks authoritarian regimes pose to the international order. No amount of threats or coercion will shake Taiwan's resolve to engage with the world, he said. At a subsequent press briefing, a spokesman of China's Taiwan Affairs Office said Beijing appreciated the position and actions of the relevant countries in upholding the One China principle. China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs also said that it was, quote, clear that the so-called President of the Republic of China no longer exists in the world, end quote, in a reference to President Lai's official title as the democratically elected leader of Taiwan. However, many countries around the world reacted sharply in direct contradiction of China's statements. Eswatini's government said that it found it regrettable that President Lai was unable to visit, but that it, quote, does not change the status of our long-standing bilateral relations, end quote. In Tokyo, Chief Cabinet Secretary Minoru Kihara stressed that maintaining the safety and integrity of international air travel is a shared global responsibility. Japanese lawmakers also voiced criticism, condemning what they described as coercive interference in sovereign decisions of third countries. Several Japanese politicians took to social media to denounce China's actions, arguing that pressuring nations to alter independent decisions sets a dangerous precedent. They warned that such tactics, including alleged debt trap diplomacy, risk damaging China's global standing. US Representative Mario Diaz-Balart also criticized the three countries for their weaponization of aviation safety, calling the move reckless and dangerous. Republican US Senator John Curtis said that China's tactic of pressuring countries to isolate Taiwan serves as a stark reminder that authoritarian regimes don't just restrict freedom at home, but seek to control it abroad. IPAC, a global alliance of nearly 300 lawmakers from more than 40 countries, including Ireland, said that China's coordinated coercion of African nations, quote, reveals a relentless drive to isolate Taiwan, now extending to an attempt to control the skies. IPAC stands with President Lai and the people of Taiwan. Like all democratic world leaders, President Lai must be free to engage with partners without interference. It is not for Beijing to determine the foreign policy of other countries, end quote. The EU also raised concerns, saying in a statement that, quote, overflight rights are a cornerstone of international civil aviation, and predictability and neutrality in airspace management are critical to safety, commerce and diplomacy. While states exercise sovereignty over their airspace, such decisions should be taken in a transparent and predictable manner, with the primary consideration being aviation safety and operational stability, an EU spokesperson said. In a related story, Bloomberg reported that Taiwan launched a 48-hour effort to salvage the trip after the denials by Seychelles, Madagascar and Mauritius, and pursued transit authorization through European countries. According to the Bloomberg report, Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs sought permission from Germany and the Czech Republic. While German authorities received the notification, their official assessment was that allowing President Lai to land in a Taiwanese official plane in Frankfurt would be problematic. Bloomberg also said that after learning that Germany was considering the request, Beijing immediately pressured Berlin to refuse. The Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs has denied claims that it rejected a request to allow an aircraft carrying Taiwanese President Lai Ching-te to cross Czech airspace. Taiwan news sources reported that as rerouting the president's flight was an emergency situation, Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs needed a response from Germany and the Czech Republic within 2 hours of making the request. And because there was no guarantee that the alternative route would work, the chances of rejection were already very high. So logistical factors may also have played into the decisions here. It would, of course, be deeply ironic if Germany and the Czech Republic, two full democracies, rejected President Lai's transit request due to direct CCP pressure, especially considering that Eswatini, an absolute monarchy, welcomed Taiwan's president with open arms. Furthermore, it's ironic that Madagascar, Seychelles and Mauritius, nations with histories as French or British colonies, are susceptible to bullying and overreach by the Chinese Communist Party, which has made no secret of its desire to annex Taiwan. It's also worth noting here that the International Civil Aviation Organization, the ICAO, which is part of the United Nations system of international organizations, is chartered to protect flight safety and security standards to ensure high-level uniform protection for air travellers globally. Yet not only did ICAO not protect President Lai in this instance, but democratic Taiwan is not allowed membership in the organisation where authoritarian countries like China have a seat, a situation that should concern all democracies, not just Taiwan. However, as far as President Lai's recent endeavours to visit Eswatini go, we're delighted to report that the story has a happy ending. President Lai and his team persisted and found an alternative route and arrived successfully in Eswatini on May 2nd. Taiwan has hailed the visit as a diplomatic breakthrough, noting the Chinese government's coercive tactics had failed. Eswatini's Deputy Prime Minister, in a statement, emphasised that her country has always regarded Taiwan as family, keeping its doors open day or night to welcome President Lai and the Taiwanese people. While the story of CCP interference in President Lai's trip to Eswatini was unfolding, another story came to light regarding China's interference in the cancellation of the world's biggest conference on human rights and technology, RightsCon 2026, which was due to take place in the Zambian capital of Lusaka from May 5th to 8th. Before we get into the details on this, let's first take a brief look at how China has been growing its influence on the African continent over the past decade or so. China's influence operations in African countries expanded to a new level after it announced its Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, in 2013. What followed was a 13-year evolution from hard infrastructure investment to a broader, market access-focused partnership designed to deeply integrate African economies with China. Since its 2013 launch, the BRI has financed over 12,000 kilometres of roads and railways and dozens of port and power facilities across the continent, with 2025 seeing a record high of over $61 billion in BRI engagement. Very often, these projects are funded by Chinese loans and built by Chinese-owned state enterprises. In June of 2025, China signalled a shift towards broader market access, offering duty-free access to a wider range of African goods ahead of the potential expiration of the US-African Growth and Opportunity Act. However, despite all of this increased investment, trade has been heavily imbalanced in China's favour. In 2025, Chinese exports to Africa were $225 billion, while imports from Africa were $123 billion, prompting demand for better market access. Before 2026, China already offered zero-tariff treatment to over 97% of tariff lines for 33 of the least developed African countries, a policy it began strengthening around 2024. On May 1st of this year, China launched a landmark policy granting duty-free access to its market for products from 53 African nations, with diplomatic ties to Beijing, covering 100% of tariff lines. This was a direct continuation of the strategic pivot from 2025, moving beyond simple infrastructure building to a comprehensive, long-term trade integration aimed at countering Western trade restrictions. The only African country excluded from all of this was Eswatini, due to its relations with Taiwan. But apart from the huge trade imbalance, China's engagement in Africa has not been without its criticisms and concerns. Recently, there have been widespread protests in several African nations regarding China's behaviour. These demonstrations generally stem from grievances over environmental destruction, labour rights violations, and the perceived extractive nature of Chinese investments. For example, in Zambia, in early 2025, a massive tailings dam burst at a Chinese-run Sino Metals leach facility, unleashing 1.5 million tonnes of toxic sludge into major rivers. This disaster poisoned water for over 700,000 residents and triggered community-led legal actions and protests. Critics also highlighted that projects lacked local employment opportunities and that Chinese firms often dominated construction, limiting technology transfer. In addition, the rapid increase in BRI loans have led to concerns over debt sustainability in some African nations, leading to negotiations over debt restructuring in a number of countries. And while the CCP claim they never interfere in other countries' domestic affairs, what follows is yet another example of how the CCP are leveraging their Belt and Road Initiative to successfully export coercion and censorship far beyond their own borders. RightsCon, the world's biggest conference on human rights and technology, was due to hold its annual summit in Zambia in the first week of May. Over 3,000 participants from more than 150 countries were scheduled to attend. However, the conference was abruptly cancelled just a week beforehand due to pressure from the Chinese government, according to the non-profit organisation Access Now that organised the event. Initially, Zambia's government had openly welcomed the proposed hosting of the summit in Lusaka and promised to assist with ensuring visas for participants. They had even advertised the event themselves and welcomed what it called its alignment with Zambia's national development agenda. Then, in late April, Thabo Kawana, Permanent Secretary for the Ministry of Information and Media, said that the conference would not go ahead to allow time to ensure the gathering aligns with Zambia's national values, policy priorities, and broader public interest considerations. In response, the conference organisers, Access Now, released a detailed statement explaining that in the process of organising this conference, they had first visited Zambia back in 2024 and coordinated closely with government officials by signing a memo of understanding with the Ministry of Technology and Science. At the same time, they established working relations with the Ministry of Tourism, the Ministry of Information and Media, and the Department of Immigration. The Access Now team regularly met with high-ranking officials to report on progress, and when they weren't in Lusaka, they convened online meetings, continuously briefing them about the scope of the conference, the breadth of its programme, and the diversity of its participants. On April 27th, one day after the government press release endorsed RightsCon, Access Now received a phone call from the Ministry of Technology and Science about an urgent issue, and were told that diplomats from the People's Republic of China were putting pressure on the government of Zambia because Taiwanese civil society participants were planning to join the conference in person. On April 28th, Zambia's local state-owned media announced that the government had postponed RightsCon, which came as a shock to the organisers, as they had no prior knowledge of the publication of the news article, nor any opportunity to comment. After a few days of failing to secure a face-to-face meeting with Zambian government officials, the organisers say it became clear that what the government wanted in order to lift the postponement was conveyed to them informally from multiple sources. In order for RightsCon to continue, they would have to moderate specific topics and exclude communities at risk, including the Taiwanese participants, from in-person and online participation. The organisers say that the manner of the government's communications process raised serious questions as regards the integrity, forthrightness and value of any future engagement based on good faith. They viewed the Zambian government decision and the way it was taken as evidence of the far reach of transnational repression, targeting civil society and effectively shrinking the spaces in which their members can operate. They said that, quote, at a time when this sector is already under immense financial and political strain, what we and our community forcefully experienced is unprecedented and existential, end quote. Rights campaigners have called the decision a blatant act of censorship and part of a broader pattern of suppression of legitimate debate. Critics say this incident makes the Zambian government look like it has no agency and that its political elites are captured by the CCP, whose influence in Zambia remains deep and multifaceted. China is Zambia's largest official lender. Following a default in 2020, a significant debt restructuring deal was finalised, and while restructuring provided breathing room, Zambia still owes over $18 billion to foreign creditors, with China being the largest, keeping the country vulnerable to shifting Chinese policies. In early 2026, Zambia authorised the use of the Chinese yuan for paying mining taxes and royalties. This moves Zambia towards using bilateral currency instruments rather than strictly dollars, reflecting high financial dependence. Others say that while China's influence may certainly have played a part, the cancellation of the RightsCon summit must be understood within the broader context of the ongoing deterioration of human rights in Zambia under the Hichilema administration, and that the government may also have been apprehensive that the event would draw international attention to its systematic efforts to undermine human rights. Given that Zambia is seeking a seat on the UN Human Rights Council, these latest actions would appear to demonstrate there's still a lot of room for improvement before Zambia can take up a seat at an international body like the UN. The RightsCon conference has been running for more than a decade now, and organisers have made efforts to host it in non-Western countries. The Zambia gathering was meant to be RightsCon debut in Southern Africa. However, given recent developments, human rights NGOs like Safeguard Defenders have become much more cautious. In the aftermath of the RightsCon 2026 cancellation, they now strongly advise that, quote, human rights defenders working on issues related to China or other issues to which the Chinese government may take offence should not travel to Zambia, as this act of appeasement by the Zambian government to pressure from China renders the Zambian government fully untrustworthy. End quote. While Zambia's cancellation of RightsCon was still being discussed in the media, a news story broke, putting Taiwan back in the headlines once again. On April 30th, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi had a phone call with US Secretary of State Marco Rubio in preparation for the highly anticipated summit between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping later in May. In a readout of the meeting, China state media reported that Wang Yi described Taiwan as the biggest risk factor in China-US relations, and said that Beijing and Washington must safeguard the hard-won stability and make thorough preparations for the coming high-level engagements. Wang called on the US to open up new space for China-US cooperation and to do its part to promote world peace. Media reports have indicated that Washington has been considering a new round of arms sales to Taiwan, following a record $11 billion package announced in December. The CCP have repeatedly raised objections to Washington's sale of weapons to Taiwan, and this topic is expected to be placed on the table again at the upcoming summit between the two leaders. Beijing claims Taiwan as part of its sovereign territory, although the PRC has never controlled or occupied Taiwan for even a second in their entire existence. The CCP have threatened to take Taiwan by force if necessary, and have been ramping up pressure via a multi-domain grey zone strategy designed for cognitive warfare and long-term coercion. The US maintains a policy of strategic ambiguity, recognizing Beijing diplomatically while remaining Taiwan's primary security backer. However, recent signals from Washington have added to uncertainty. The US President Trump's suggestion that Taiwan arms sales could be discussed with Xi has raised concerns in Taipei about becoming a bargaining chip in broader negotiations. While Trump has described enjoying an upbeat relationship with Xi, tensions between the world's two largest economies persist amid a barrage of economic sanctions, export controls and tariffs. Following their October meeting in Busan, South Korea, the two leaders have repeatedly discussed the Taiwan question by phone after Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi's remarks in November suggested Japan could deploy its military forces in the event of a conflict in the Taiwan Strait, a comment that has caused consternation among CCP officials and their supporters. Taiwan sits at the heart of the military balance in the Western Pacific, so even a nuanced change in US wording could affect Beijing's assessment of US resolve to continue its support to Taiwan. At a summit with Biden in 2024, Xi asked him to change the US language on Taiwan to "We oppose Taiwan independence" from the current version. The US has declined to make the change. A recent article in the Taipei Times reported that people involved in the preparation for Trump's trip say privately that China has been constantly sending similar signals at a working level ahead of the summit, but declined to discuss the details, citing confidentiality of the talks. With Taiwan now firmly at the top of China's agenda, the upcoming Xi-Trump meeting faces a delicate balancing act. Any misstep risks amplifying tensions across the Taiwan Strait, turning what Beijing calls the biggest risk factor in China-US relations into the most dangerous one. But if one thing is clear from all of the examples we've discussed so far, it is that Beijing spares no effort to pressure governments and organisations, big and small, all around the world, into erasing Taiwan's sovereignty. However, a quote in a recent article by Chris Horton in Nikkei Asia makes a very important observation. He says, despite all its power, Xi Jinping's CCP cannot marginalize Taiwan alone. It requires our help to do it. So isn't it time for all of us who value freedom and democracy to stand up and support Taiwan? If you'd like to find out more about the topics discussed in this episode of Perspectives with Nilo, we've placed additional information and links on our blog site at pwnilo.com. We'd also love to hear your feedback. Are the CCP's attempts to isolate Taiwan a legitimate diplomatic stance or a form of coercion? Are global institutions doing enough to protect smaller democracies from pressure by larger powers? Drop us a comment on our Perspectives with Nilo social media pages or whichever app you use to listen to the podcast. You can also contact us via our blog at pwnilo.com and subscribe to our mailing list for regular updates. If you enjoyed this episode and you don't want to miss any future episodes, please also consider following us on your favourite podcast app. This is the best way to support us and really helps motivate us to keep producing content. But that's where we leave it for now. Thank you for listening, and until the next time, Slán agus Banach.